Atomic Heart, at least on paper, looks like the type of game that would collapse under the weight of its own ambition. It wants to be a first-person shooter, an action RPG, a puzzle game, and a retro-futuristic dystopia, and a dark comedy, and a horror game, and at times, a very obvious attempt to capture the magic of BioShock. Now that is a lot for any one game to carry, especially one from a brand new IP. Now I had Atomic Heart sitting in my backlog since the game came out in 2023, and it never looked bad, but there was always something else ahead of it that I wanted to play first. And then when Atomic Heart 2 was announced, I suddenly wanted to know whether this universe was actually worth continuing. So, I finally got around to playing it, and after finishing the base campaign, I understand why Mudfish wants to return to this world. Atomic Heart is by no means a masterpiece. Its writing is inconsistent, its open areas are much weaker than its handcrafted facilities, and it never reaches the narrative heights of games that inspired it. But it does have something many technical component games never develop: an identity. Its world is strange, its combat is satisfying, its visual design is memorable. Even when the humor falls flat or the structure starts fighting against itself, Atomic Heart rarely feels empty. It's messy, derivative, and uneven, but it's also a fair bit better than what it should be. So just a heads up before we get into the meat and potatoes of this review, this is only going to be covering the base campaign, not the post-launch DLC, and there's also going to be some spoilers for the story later in the video, so keep that in mind going forward. Anyway, let's get started. The strongest part of Atomic Heart is its world. Not necessarily its plot, definitely not its characters, and not even the graphics themselves. It's a combination of the architecture, the propaganda, the robots, the music, the laboratories, and its absurd confidence of the society that built all of this. The game takes place in an alternate version of 1955, centered around the Soviet scientific complex known as Facility 3826. In this version of history, the discovery of polymer has accelerated technology far beyond anything that existed in the real 1950s. Robots are performing manual labor, scientists are reshaping biology, and an entire society is preparing to connect through a neural network called Koltev 2.0. Maybe it isn't that far from our real world, actually. And of course, naturally, everything goes wrong. The comparisons to BioShock are impossible to avoid. Atomic Heart is not set in the same universe, but it uses a very familiar foundation, a magnificent technology utopia built around the ideology of progress, which has already begun rotting underneath the surface. You walk through museums celebrating human achievement while corpses are laying around the corner. You have smiling propaganda presents technology as the answer to every human problem, while the same technology is tearing people apart. Every facility feels like a monument to intelligence without any form of restraint. Atomic Heart wears its influences openly, but inspiration is not automatically a flaw. The real question is whether the game brings enough of itself to the idea, and visually, I believe Atomic Heart does achieve this goal. In the case of BioShock, Rapture is defined by underwater art deco, but in Atomic Heart, Facility 3826 is defined by Soviet retrofuturism, monumental buildings, polished metal, strange statues, cheerful public service robots, and scientific machinery that looks both decades old and at the same time really advanced. The game can move from beautiful to disgusting without any warning. One room looks like a preserved vision of the future, the next contains a mass of organic material growing through machinery. And then you walk into a theatre or a museum or an underground laboratory or some impossible chamber built around an experiment nobody ever should have attempted. And this unpredictability is where Atomic Heart is at its best. The interiors feel very well authored. They control what you see, when you see it, and how long the atmosphere has to build. The game can introduce an enemy through sound, or frame a piece of machinery like a work of art, or let you slowly understand what happened through the environment. It's unfortunate, however, that the outside areas never really create the same feeling. Atomic Heart is often described as open world, but I'd say it's closer to a series of large open zones, connecting more focused story locations and optional testing grounds. Those zones are functional, they do give you something to explore, to collect resources and find upgrades. They also contain the game's security network, with cameras, alert systems, and repair drones constantly responding to what you do. Now, on paper, that does sound dynamic. In practice, it becomes a little bit more exhausting. Enemies are repaired, reinforcements arrive, and cameras constantly spot you. The world can feel less like a place to explore, and more like a system that's designed to keep interrupting you. Fighting through it is not always difficult, but it often feels less rewarding than clearing through a carefully designed laboratory of enemies. And that contrast defines most of this game. Inside a facility, I wanted to see what was behind almost every door. Outside, I just wanted to reach the next facility. The open zones feel like connective tissue, whereas the interiors are like the actual body of the game. Now, that does not make the world a failure. If anything, the fact that I was still interested in the Facility 3826 by the end proves just how strong this central concept is. The game constantly suggests that there is more happening than the campaign has time to show. More experiments, more cities, more use for polymer, and the consequences of waiting outside this one disaster. And this is where I become really interested in sequels to this game, because Atomic Heart feels like the first draft of a universe that has so much greater potential. It never reaches the same thematic clarity of BioShock, and its world is not always presented through the strongest possible structure. But it creates enough mystery and enough visual identity that I finish the game wanting to know more or what happens next in this world. And for a first entry in a series, that's a pretty good accomplishment. The combat is another area where Atomic Heart works better than I expected it to. It's by no means revolutionary, but it does give you enough options to develop a style rather than forcing you into one correct build. You have conventional firearms, energy weapons, melee weapons, and abilities delivered through the polymer glove on P3's left hand. You can shock machines, freeze enemies, lift groups into the air, create defensive barriers, or combine polymer with elemental damage. The important part is that you do not need to use everything equally. In my playthrough, I focused mostly on weapons, health, and direct character upgrades, rather than building an entire playstyle around the glove's abilities. The game allowed that approach to work. I could still use shock when machines needed to be interrupted, or mix in another ability when the fight demanded it, but I never felt punished for preferring conventional weapons and upgraded weapons over abilities. And that flexibility makes the progression system satisfying. Resources are gathered from defeated enemies and almost everything around you. Drawers, cabinets, desks, and machinery can all be stripped for materials, and the glove lets you vacuum the items towards you, which turns what could be a painfully slow looting into one of the most game's distinctive little mechanics. You then take those resources to upgrade stations to improve weapons, craft ammunition, and unlock more abilities. Mechanically, none of this is especially unusual. What makes it memorable is the presentation, particularly Nora, the aggressively sexual repair cabinet that speaks to P3 like an appliance possessed by a homicidal dating app. Yes, it's stupid. Yes, it's over the top. But my god, did I love it. It worked so well. Atomic Heart is full of ideas that should become annoying much faster than they do. And Nora is one of them. The joke is not subtle, but neither is anything else in this world. Turning the upgrade menu into a character gives a basic system more personality than it otherwise should have. The weapons also have enough impact to keep the campaign moving. Melee attacks feel heavy and shotguns have the aggression that they need, and upgrade weapons can become powerful without making every encounter completely meaningless. Now, I just played the game on normal difficulty, and I would not describe the game as especially punishing. There were definitely some fights that demanded more attention, particularly when several enemy types were working together, but it never became a brutal resource survival game, and that suited the experience of Atomic Heart. And this game is at its best when it lets you improvise, knock enemies down, shock a machine, switch weapons, dodge a heavy attack, and use the environment to stop yourself from being surrounded. The enemy roster supports that reasonably well. You have your basic humanoid robots, flying machines, heavier industrial models, and mutated organic creatures that require different responses. Some enemies are agile, some are armored, and some are dangerous mainly because they create pressure while something larger moves in. The bosses are generally one of the stronger parts of combat. Hedgie is an early highlight because the fight combines spectacle, movement, and environmental interaction. Other bosses lean more heavily on reading attacks, dodging, and choosing when to commit damage. They are by no means all equally memorable, but they help give the campaign a sense of escalation. The final confrontation with the twins, on the ending route where P3 chooses to confront one of the characters, is the best example of this. Their movement presentation is important to the game's visual identity and makes the battle feel like a genuine finale, rather than another large enemy with another large health bar. But the combat is not perfect, there is definitely some weaknesses. Dodging can feel awkward in tight spaces, some encounters throw enough bodies at you that the fight becomes visual noise, and the repair system in the open zone can make victory feel temporary because the world begins rebuilding what you destroyed almost immediately. The game also gives you many systems without always giving you each of them equal importance. There are abilities I barely touched and upgrades that I felt much more practical than others, but the foundation is there and it is solid. Now, I enjoyed the fighting and I enjoyed upgrading my weapons, and the sense of becoming stronger was satisfying. Now, that sounds like a basic premise for an action game, but plenty of ambitious games have failed at these fundamentals, and fortunately, Atomic Heart does not. The puzzles are mostly fine, and I get that may sound dismissive, but I mean it as a compliment. They break up the combat without usually stopping the game for too long. Some involve locks, timing, or pattern recognition. Others are built directly into a facility asking you to move platforms, manipulate machinery, or understand how a strange scientific space functions. The best puzzles are the ones that feel like part of the world rather than a minigame placed at the front of a door. The optional testing grounds are also worthwhile because they give more experimental level design room to breathe. They can offer useful blueprints and upgrades, but their greater value lies in the greater focus and controlled design, which the open world lacks, unfortunately. Now that creates a strange situation where some of the optional underground areas feel more essential to Atomic Heart's identity than much of the main overworld. Again, the game is strongest when it knows exactly what space it wants you to move through. So from this point, I'm going to be discussing the story and the ending, so there's going to be some spoilers here, and I'm probably going to mispronounce some names. Forgive me, comrade. Atomic Heart's plot is more competent than it is brilliant. So, we have the Major Sergei Nechenkov, which is better known as P3, which is who you play as, is sent into Facility 3826 by scientist Dmitry Shchentov after the facility's robots begin attacking humans. What begins as a mission to contain a disaster gradually becomes a conspiracy involving Collective, the polymer technology, and P3's damaged memory and the people guiding him through this crisis. The game does provide enough mystery to maintain momentum throughout the game. There are betrayals, hidden experiments, altered memories, and questions about who is actually controlling who. Once again, the Bioshock comparison becomes unavoidable. Now, P3 moves through the remains of a failed utopia while the voice in his ear provides direction. The story questions obedience, free will, and whether the protagonist understands his own role in events. It builds towards the possibility that the person you trusted may have been the one using you the whole time. And the difference is in execution here. Bioshock's most famous revelation changes how the player understands both the story and the act of following instructions in a video game. Now, Atomic Heart contains similar ingredients, but its twists do not reshape the entire experience with the same precision. The game reveals that P3 has been conditioned and that his blackouts have been used to manipulate him, and that Charles is not simply a helpful artificial intelligence. He is connected to Sharatin Zakharov, whose consciousness survives through polymer and who has his own plan for the future. Again, I am very sorry about these pronunciations. But anyway, these are very meaningful revelations. The problem is that the story delivers so much information so quickly, particularly near the end, that the impact becomes weaker than the idea themselves. For most of the campaign, I was carried more by curiosity than any form of emotional attachments. I wanted to know what the big conspiracy was and what was being hidden. I wanted to understand P3's past. I wanted to know what Charles really was and why everyone seemed to have a different version of the truth. But rarely was I ever deeply invested in the relationships between any of these characters. And that creates an ending where my reaction was less, whoa, that changes everything, and more, that explains what they were doing. Oh, okay, it works, it makes sense. So at the end of the game, the player is given a choice. P3 can reject the entire conflict and leave, producing a short ending, or he can return for one final battle, and the second path leads to a battle with the twins and the revelation that Charles is manipulating him. Now, the spectacle is strong, but the closure is limited. The twins' fight gives the finale a fair bit of energy, and Charles becomes something far more dangerous that gives the story a final shock. But the base game ends by opening more questions rather than resolving the entire conflict. Now, this is important, especially now the universe is continuing through DLCs and a full-blown sequel. The ending did not transform Atomic Heart into a narrative masterpiece for me. What it did was make the world feel larger than this one campaign, and that's where this story really succeeds. The plot itself is very familiar, but the world around the plot I found to be much more interesting. The strongest story material is not always a conversation or a dramatic reveal. It's the idea of polymer connecting minds. It's the possibility of technology eliminating privacy and individual control. It's like a society celebrating progress while quietly building the machinery for complete obedience. And these are themes that Atomic Heart touches heavily, but it does not explore them with enough discipline. It understands what makes those ideas interesting, it just does not always know when to slow down, when to trust the player, or when to let that one revelation breathe before introducing another. And this is one of the biggest opportunities for Atomic Heart 2. The sequel does not need a more complicated plot, it just needs a plot that's better told. Now, the characters are probably the most inconsistent part of this game, and P3, the player-controlled protagonist, is probably the best example. He can be funny, his anger and impatience sometimes fits the situations, and his sarcastic attitude gives him more personality than a silent protagonist would have had. But the game rarely knows when he needs to just shut the fuck up. The repeated crispy critters, the consistent arguments with Charles, and the need to place a joke or insult into so many moments can undermine the atmosphere. Atomic Heart creates rooms that should be allowed to feel disturbing, lonely, or mysterious, and then fills the silence before the environment has a chance to speak for itself. Kind of like a shitty MCU movie. Now, I don't want to go as far as to say that P3 is a game-ruining protagonist. He's just inconsistent. Sometimes he's funny, sometimes he's annoying. Usually he's tolerable, occasionally exhausting. Now the reveal towards the end of this game about his history does give him quite a bit more weight with his story, but much of that depth arrives too late to fully repair the abrasive first impression of him. And then we have Charles, who has the opposite problem. For most of the campaign, he feels functional rather than fascinating. He explains technology, provides objectives, and gives P3 somebody to argue with. He fills the role these games often assign to a voice traveling with the protagonist. Once his real identity and motives become clear, earlier conversations gain more meaning, which is a good thing. Now that is good retroactive character writing, but it exposes how little personality he seems to have before the twist. Charles becomes important before he becomes emotionally compelling. Nora isn't really a character, at least in the traditional sense, but she's memorable because the game commits completely to her bit. She's a repair cabinet with the energy of a violent sexual predator, and that sentence tells you almost everything you need to know about Atomic Heart's sense of humor. I find it funny, but I know a lot of people won't. And then there's the twins. The twins are probably the best example of this game understanding its own appeal. Oh yeah, they are sexualized. This game knows exactly what it's doing. Their designs are elegant, feminine, and deliberately attention-grabbing. But the reason they work is that this design does not just stop at simple sex appeal. They are also very threatening. Their movements are graceful in a way that never looks completely human. Their polished bodies, expressionless faces, and unnatural flexibility create a contrast between beauty and violence. They look like the works of art designed by a society that no longer understands the difference between performance, control, and intimidation. And that contrast makes them very memorable. If they were only just dangerous, then it would just be another pair of robots. But because they're both, they are a symbol of Atomic Heart itself. Excessive, stylish, unsettling, and impossible to mistake for anything else. We've all seen the fan art of the twins out there. There's people out here that don't even know what the game is, but know who the twins are. And that's just a few of the characters in this game. This game doesn't have a great ensemble cast. Many supporting characters are more useful to the plot rather than being developed, and some appear only long enough to deliver some information or push P3 towards the next objective. But what is there does have some personality. Now, I would rather play a flawed game with a distinctive voice than a perfectly clean game without nothing to say and nobody to remember. And Atomic Heart is definitely not empty. Well, I should probably acknowledge the controversy behind this game, and it is difficult to discuss Atomic Heart without at least acknowledging the controversy surrounding this game and Mudfish, who are the developers. So, the game launched in February of 2023, which is about a year into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Mudfish has Russian roots. Now, while representing itself as an international company headquartered in Cyprus, critics questioned the studio's investors, its business connections, and its use of Soviet imagery, and whether buying the game could financially benefit the interests connected to Russia. There was also allegations concerning a privacy policy on Russian language Mudfish storefront, so Mudfish denied that the game or its website was harvesting data for Russian authorities, and called the policy outdated and incorrect, and then shut down the store in question. Also, on top of that, Ukraine's Ministry of Digital Transformation publicly called for the game's distribution to be restricted. Now, obviously, people are entitled to decide what games they do and don't purchase. Me, personally, I'm not going to sit here and telling you that you buying a video game is supporting any war anywhere. And if we're going to look into Mudfish and their connection to governments, well, we can apply that logic to anything in your living room and what they're connected to. So I do think there's a bit of a one-sided conversation there, but that is just something that's worth addressing because I know it is going to pop up. I also don't think that buying this game means you're pro-communist in any way, and purely for the purpose of this review, my thoughts and verdicts is based primarily on the game I played, but I did think I had to acknowledge this, what I consider to be stupid controversy surrounding this game. So after leaving Atomic Heart in my backlog for a couple years, where did I finally land on it? Well, it's better than what it should be, but that does not mean it's necessarily a masterpiece or even a great video game. It's nowhere near as well written as BioShock, and its themes are much less focused. Its protagonist can be irritating, and the open zones are definitely weaker than the facilities. The humor is inconsistent, and the ending raises more questions than what it answered. But those flaws don't completely bury what works in this game. The combat is satisfying. The weapons and upgrades let you build a playstyle that does suit you. The bosses are genuinely strong, and the puzzles provide enough variety without taking control of the entire experience. Most importantly, the world in this game has identity. The alternate 1955 setting, polymer technology, propaganda, robots, laboratories, the music, very Russian as well, and body horror, all combined into something that is memorable. Even when Atomic Heart resembles other games that did a lot of these things better, it rarely looks or sounds like a generic product. So I played through this game on PC and it was pretty stable. I think I only had one crash, but no persistent technical problem that seriously damaged my experience. And that matters because Atomic Heart was attempting far too many things for all of them to work perfectly. It wanted combat, powers, crafting, exploration, puzzles, horror, comedy, political themes, a conspiracy, and an enormous alternate history setting. And not all those shots land, but enough of them do get at least close enough. There are games that are far more polished than Atomic Heart, but a lot of them are also easier to forget. They function, they finish, and then that's it. They leave no mark, you just move on. Atomic Heart at least did leave a mark. Sometimes that mark was a very well-built facility. Sometimes it was a strong boss fight. Sometimes it was an aggressive, horny refrigerator shouting at you while I was trying to upgrade my shotgun. Sometimes it was one of the twins stepping on my neck and me saying, "Harder, mummy." But these are all experiences you do remember. I would be much more hesitant to recommend this game at full price right now, especially to somebody expecting a narrative experience on the level of, again, BioShock. Atomic Heart does not have that quality of writing or that level of thematic control. On sale, however, I do think it's worth playing. It is especially easy to recommend to players who enjoy single-player shooters, strange science fiction, alternate history, and games that are willing to be ridiculous without becoming completely disposable. The important thing is to enter the game with the right expectations. Do not play Atomic Heart because you expect this to be the next BioShock. Play it because you want a competent, strange, and flawed shooter with a world that has the potential to become something much greater. And that's what I found in Atomic Heart. The sequel announcement is the reason I finally moved this game up on my backlog list, and by the end I was more interested in the universe than when I started playing this game. And that's not the reaction that a failed game would create. Atomic Heart lays the foundation and establishes the visual identity, the combat, the technology, and the tone. It also makes the weaknesses of this game extremely obvious. Atomic Heart 2 needs stronger presentation in its storytelling. It needs a protagonist who can speak without filling every second of silence. It needs a story that explores control, identity, technology progress, rather than simply gesturing towards them. If it is going to have an open world, it needs open world structure that supports handcrafted locations instead of separating them with weaker material. And it needs to push further into the weird science, the enemy design, and visual imagination that made this game worth remembering. The potential is already here. Atomic Heart is far from brilliant, it's definitely not a hidden classic, and it's definitely not the game that BioShock fans have been waiting for. Judas might be the closest you're going to get for something new. I don't know, to be determined. But it's ambitious, memorable, and much more successful than its mess of competing ideas suggest it should be. Sometimes a first game does not need to perfect the universe, sometimes it only needs to prove that the universe deserves another chance. And that is exactly what Atomic Heart did for me.